I think policy as code solves a lot of the problems, but when it comes to the big picture, I think what policy as code and implementing, like you said, build time, runtime checks using policy as code, I think it takes care of a lot of the DevOps responsibilities. I'm not talking about the team, but I'm just talking about the processes. But I think in regard to the big picture, what it really does, it reinforces this message of security.
Welcome to the SaC podcast. Here we discuss different topics to streamline security from code to cloud. We will talk to experts and leaders in cloud security about the most pressing challenges to balance security and agility. You will get tangible advice to secure your infrastructure using the right combination of technology, people, and culture. I'm your host Mo, joined today by Tony Shong, a solution architect at Magalix, to talk about what is policy as code or codified policies as a way to scale security and compliance in cloud infrastructure.
I started out many years ago, over 2 decades, doing IT system administration, supporting NT4, Active Directory Exchange, corporate IT. And then over the years, I transferred to more enterprise computing, application support, production ops before there was like a DevOps team. And then as the cloud became the predominant way, at least in my world, that people were provisioning infrastructure, I moved to the cloud, got into DevOps. I've been a data engineer, I've been a CTO, a co-founder, worn many different hats. And now I'm a solutions architect at Magalix, helping people understand their compliance needs and helping them implement a policy as code solution.
This podcast is sponsored by Magalix. Magalix streamlines security from code to cloud using codified policies, tight integration with your software development lifecycle, and with the right insights. For more details, visit our website, magalix.com. In my previous episode with Ahmed Badran, we discussed what is security as code. Security as code is about codifying policies and standards and automating their enforcements. Since we're focusing today on codified policies, what does policy as code mean in simple terms?
To me, having codified policies really accomplishes a couple of things. I think the first thing that comes to mind is security. I think if we're in a world where your infrastructure is codified, obviously your microservices are codified, right? I think when everything is orchestrated, you want to make sure that maybe certain flags are enabled, certain security flags are enabled or configurations. And so to me, one aspect of policy as code is ensuring that not only is your code, you have the right configurations in place to make sure that you're secure, but also applying those same policies to a running environment to make sure you're constantly staying secure, but you're doing it all through code. So instead of using like a UI or a console or alerting, you can codify the things which you want to secure and then enforce those against either your code itself or your environment.
Most of the major cloud providers offer dozens of services and products. AWS alone has more than 200 products and services at the time of this episode. As a matter of fact, a company uses on average 20 to 30 cloud services and products. With all the possible ways things can go wrong with these services, the operational and security complexity is exponentially increasing. So, is there a correlation between the increased complexity of cloud infrastructure and the rising popularity of codified policies?
Sure. From just my own, maybe this is a bit anecdotal, but from my own experience, I think the enterprise, I think cutting edge folks, I've been in startups, we leverage DevOps, we've been leveraging DevOps as a culture for a long time. It's been proven out. We're able to increase agility, flexibility, couple that with agile methodology back in maybe a decade ago. And you have this nice harmonious way of developing code and integrating systems and software. And I think now as the enterprise is starting to adopt more of these DevOps principles, they have a need to say, big enterprises have probably much more regulation that they have to deal with on top of other things. And so I think as the enterprise starts adopting these DevOps principles, like cloud native, Kubernetes, things of this nature, security has always been something that they need to take care of, especially like in areas of like fintech, even social media when they need to secure the data, right? And so as enterprises start adopting this DevOps methodology, they have to think about security. And I think because of recent, breakthroughs in policy as code, a lot of these initiatives are getting open source through the cloud native, organization. It's becoming much more prevalent. There's much more eyes on it. And, much like other open source projects, the more eyes are on it, the more people that adopt it, the faster it gets, the faster it becomes better. And I think it's been a couple of years since, OPA and these other solutions have been out. And I think now it's just kind of been the right timing for those to gain traction.
Enforcing policies and standards is not a new concept. It has been there for decades. Many existing policy or ACL systems do not practice policy as code, however. Many policies are set by clicking in a GUI, which is not easily repeatable nor versionable. They usually don't provide any system for testing policies other than testing an action that would violate the policy. This makes it actually difficult for automated testing, and the policy language itself varies by product. It seems that the new concept of codifying policies is a natural evolution of infrastructure as code. So, what problems does policy as code solve for engineering teams?
To me, it solves a couple of problems. I think first, when you apply policy as code to a running environment, you have an idea in real time what is compliant and what is not. And what I mean by compliance, I use these terms interchangeably. It's probably wrong, but just for the sake of the ease of conversation, when I talk about compliance, governance, security in this context, I'm really talking about standards in your organization, simply put. And so understanding what is in compliance with your standards and what is not is the first problem that this solves. I mean, nobody is going to check every single pod to make sure every single configuration is aligned. Like that doesn't make sense. It doesn't scale. It's probably impossible if you have to catch up and maintain that if you have a very, very large cloud native deployment. So first off, knowing what's going on. You also keep a running tab of what's compliant, right? From a holistic level, instead of just looking at one deployment, you could look at your fleet of clusters across your multi-cloud environment, right? So having that the same policy scale across a multi-cloud, even on-prem, allows you to have this uniformity regardless of what's under the hood. So in terms of cloud native, I think it's one of the beauties of Kubernetes. It's kind of this lift and shift idea that if I deploy Kubernetes anywhere, I can deploy the same artifacts, the same infrastructure, the same architecture and whatnot. And policy really help define that that uniformity across all of my cloud systems. And I think thirdly, which is not just in the running environment, but more importantly, as organizations adopt this more secdevops or DevSecOps approach, you want to start incorporating the security left. And what I mean by this is just like how developers are using CI/CD today for like unit testing to ensure they're not introducing any bugs into the system. You could do the same thing with policy. So just to take that a step deeper, let's say, for example, we're in an organization where the developers have much more autonomy over their microservices, meaning they regarding specific Kubernetes, let's say the developer creates a deployment YAML file, a service file, maybe an ingress YAML, and within those they configure everything. And so unbeknownst to them, they have the ability to deploy these things, but they might be deploying configurations that are very lax in security. Maybe the the containers are running as root, or some configuration that's not adhering to the org standards, you don't want to introduce those into your environment. The people that are maintaining this are going to be chasing their tail all day, trying to chase people down and get these fixed. But instead, what they do is they codify their policies, incorporate that into their CI/CD jobs, and quote unquote shift left. So when the developer is building their deployment YAML or their Helm chart or whatnot, and if they're doing something there that's not doesn't adhere to the organizations, it can flag it, and the developer can then remedy that even before the ops person or whoever's in charge of the environment has to even know about it. So really trying to catch these violations as early in the SDLC as possible, and then because shops are DevOps now, reusing their CI/CD jobs to incorporate this.
We see companies approaching policy as code in different ways. Some would see it as a new way for security engineers to secure infrastructure without slowing down operations, while others see it as a tool to help DevOps secure their infrastructure and applications without the need for manual security review. So, who policy as code is built for?
That's a great question. I think first and foremost, I think that maybe, it's going to vary between organization and organization. In my opinion, this is probably a DevOps responsibility. I think the reason because you have the software development team that's focusing on solving the business challenges, right? The business logic. You have the security folks who understand security better than anybody, right? And so they understand the different algorithms when it comes to security, the different ways that the hacker is trying to compromise the system. They understand this much more. And then kind of in the middle, you have a DevOps engineer who understands how what the software engineer is working on, how that gets deployed, and how to manage this application. And so to me, because they kind of, the DevOps engineer sees under the hood, and because a security engineer is not necessarily a Kubernetes administrator, neither is a software engineer. And I think because, especially in cloud native and even infrastructure, because the DevOps person is most likely, developing that infrastructure as code, managing the infrastructure, managing Kubernetes, provisioning Kubernetes, it makes sense that, at least in this use case, the policy, they have their hands in the CI/CD as well. So it makes sense that a DevOps engineer is probably going to manage the policies as well. Now, mind you, who's going to write them? I think, again, that's organization specific, But in my personal experience, that to me most likely will fall on the shoulders of the DevOps, right? Because they're managing the infrastructure anyway, and because they understand Kubernetes the most likely, it just makes sense that they would be developing or at least applying those policies because they understand the impact of what those policies can or cannot do.
If DevOps should own the codification of policies, we should expect a lot of automation and innovative ways of using it. But first, what are the main characteristics of policy codification programming language? Any policy language need to have three main qualities. First, they need to be non-programmer friendly. Non-programmers need the ability to enforce certain rules within a system without complex structures. Second, they need also to be programmer friendly. At the same time, the language needs to support programmer-friendly constructs such as conditionals, loops, and functions for complex policies that a programmer might be writing. And finally, they need, of course, to be safe. Most policy languages are used in security-sensitive environments. They must not be able to crash the host system or access the system resources without an explicit approval. I asked Tony to share 1 to 2 examples to clarify further why the DevOps engineers are the best to codify policies.
I think TLS 1.0 has been deemed maybe not as secure but maybe a DevOps engineer doesn't quite know that. And so if a security engineer says, look, these protocols have been defined as insecure, you need to use the latest. And so if they can communicate that to the DevOps team, when anything gets provisioned that tries to use that insecure protocol, the DevOps team can then say, hey, the security team says this is insecure, I trust them, let me write a policy that prevents this protocol from being used within the domain of my control, which is probably Kubernetes and my cloud or my on-prem footprint, right? And then if I take this codified policy and apply that back to my CI/CD jobs, the developer, mind you, they might not necessarily care about insecure protocols, but when they try to build their artifacts, they're going to get some feedback that says, you're trying to use this insecure protocol, part of the configuration, you can't use it because of XYZ reason, contact so-and-so for more information, right? And I think in a real world case, this is how I see the three different stakeholders of deploying modern day secure DevOps applications, of like how this will work. Now, mind you, every organization is different, but I think this is where everyone's expertise really plays a role in this kind of trinity of teams that really can strive for secure, deploying and maintaining secure applications, because you have three experts in three different domains that need to come together to form, a secure application and secure infrastructure.
Policy codification should bring ops, security, and developers together to secure their infrastructure and move fast. Security teams want to protect the current value of company products and data. Developers want to increase the value of these products, however, which requires changes and disruptions of the status quo. Operations teams, on the other hand, want to keep systems stable and available all the time for their customers. Friction is highly possible given these conflicting changes. So, how can codified policies help these teams work closer together?
I think policyascode solves a lot of the problems. But when it comes to the big picture, I think what policyascode and implementing, like you said, build time, commit time, build time, runtime checks using policyascode, I think it takes care of a lot of the DevOps responsibilities. I'm not talking about the team, but I'm just talking about the processes. But I think in regard to the big picture, what it really does, it reinforces this message of security. And the reason why I say that is because imagine a developer is building a new microservice. They build the job, they run a build job for the first time, and one of their proposed configurations is in violation. And again, going back to the previous example, maybe security isn't necessarily on top of their mind. But what this does, it actually forces, in a way, the developer to start considering, hey, I have to build a secure configuration in order for my build jobs to pass, in order for me to bundle this package, and in this case, build my container image and be able to deploy it. So I think in terms of the big picture, policyascode really reinforces the message that security is really everyone's, in terms of the development, the tech side of things, really everyone's responsibility. But when you think about it piece by piece, it plays a huge role in the SDLC and pretty much every phase of the software development lifecycle, because you can check your policies at the commit time using Git pre-commit hooks. If you have a CI/CD system, you can check it there. So every time you open a pull request, you can have it trigger there if you wish. And then also you could do it at deploy time. In Kubernetes, you can use the mission controller. So if someone is if someone wants to bypass all of that, or you don't have it, and someone wants to deploy a policy violating configuration, it gets blocked there. And then for those entities that are already deployed, you can catch it at runtime. So it plays a huge role in the SDLC, but it also reinforces that message that security is something that everyone needs to pay attention to.
Policy as code decouples decision logic from business logic and services. And we can even go as far as to make the policy decisions based on the application or the environment context. I asked Tony about some of his personal experiences that made him realize the value of codified policies with different applications in cloud environments.
Really, in my own experience, it's really about the scale. So I'll tell you a quick story. So when I've been the last couple, I would say, not as a solution architect, but in previous roles, I've worked in smaller shops and startups. And so what I've noticed is that security isn't really a consideration. People are trying to move fast. And so when I tried to play with Poly as code initially, what I saw was kind of an eye-opener, right? Because as the developers are building microservices as quickly as possible, the minute that I turned on the policy as code within my production Kubernetes cluster, I was able to see a lot of violations. Developers are running containers as root. That's a very popular one. I think that's, for a lot of times, I think that's what triggers people to look at the policy as code solution, because every time a new microservice is deployed, or actually at any time there's a change, that's something that I need to check, right? And so what policy as code allows me to do, it allows me to scale those checks. And what was really eye-opening for me is the more policies that I apply, the more violations I'm discovering. So it's really eye-opening just how insecure default Kubernetes really is. And so just from those experiences, policy as code really, I guess the word I'm looking for, it kind of wakes people up in terms of security. And I could talk for days about security initiatives in different places, but it really wakes people up because there's proof, right? Policy as code kicks in, they get violated, and you can show people, look, this is exactly what we're building. This is why it's violated. This is why it's a problem. We need to fix it. And if you catch that early on, especially during your POC phases in your dev environments or such, in your staging environment, you can really, really be as proactive as possible and not introduce these exploits or these vulnerabilities or violations in prod. And if you do, I'm going to be spending all day trying to fix those while the developer continues to make changes, and which they should, right? But I just don't want to spend all day chasing the same violations over and over again for either edited artifacts or new ones, right? So policy as code can really help scale that challenge of trying to maintain compliance. We'll actually see that you're compliant and maintain it.
A simple Google search for policy as code gives you dozens of tools and startups in this area. Technology is important, of course, but it should not be your starting point when you think about the adoption of codified policies. There are 4 key pillars that must be considered when looking to shift to the DevOps culture and use policy as code in your organization. First, people. Restructuring DevOps and security teams to establish efficient cooperation between them, as well as offering good quality and targeted training, will ensure that security becomes a frame of mind rather than a hindrance. Second, processes. Aim to further improve collaboration between people to achieve more secure development processes as a whole. Third, technologies. With the right technologies in place, you will enable employees to execute these processes as well as automate them. Finally, governance, which measures the performance of other elements that can point out where more focus is needed to ensure all parts of your culture form together. So I wanted to have Tony's inputs on what is the ideal culture that would make codified policies work at their best.
So the best way to get started, I would say, is build a POC and try to get a single policy running in a non-production environment and see what happens. I think there's no substitution for experience, I think, in this case. And every environment is different. But I think getting familiar with the terminology and just getting one policy applied to your Kubernetes cluster is a great way to get started, because you're going to understand what's at stake in terms of how to install it, how to configure it, how to troubleshoot it. And then after you have that system in place, then you can start actually working on the policy. So understanding the whole policies code ecosystem is great. And I think there's no substitution for experience. So try it. Do it in a lab, whether you're using Minikube, Kind, or whatnot, just get it going. And I think, so that's on the technical side, but I think kind of on the non-technical side, company adoption, I think it helps having it and coming it from two different angles. Obviously, if it comes from the top down and your industry is regulated, the business you're in is regulated by industry, coming from the top down or from the outside in, that's a driver, no doubt. You have to be compliant with this regulation, or else you're going to get fined, or you can't do business, or you can't even relaunch at that matter if you're in a startup. So I think from that aspect, that's a driver. But I think from another angle, there's kind of this inside out pathway that I think starts from your champions, right? And I think in your organization, I feel like in every organization, there is somebody that always seems to be on the forefront of something like of this cutting edge stuff. And I mean stuff because it could be all types of things, but let's say security. It's probably your DevOps engineer, or maybe your security engineer. There's somebody in your organization that knows about security or cloud native security and is an advocate. And so leveraging their enthusiasm, their knowledge, their their, what's the word I'm looking for? Their constant feedback of that, hey, we have to be secure. I think putting those folks in a team, coupled with maybe a security engineer if you have it, or a software engineer, maybe even a lead or a senior person, putting them all together in a small mini project to get it going, I think is great. I know those as Tiger teams. I stole that term from NASA, which is getting a specialist from different domains and putting them together to POC it out. I think letting people do their job, what they love, what they're most knowledgeable about, I think is a great way to get the ball rolling. I've done this in many other organizations for different projects. I remember doing this over 10 years ago when we were rolling out Agile and sprints, or Scrum in particular. I remember we started with one new project, one new initiative, and we tried to figure it out, work all the kinks, built the process, and then deployed it out to the rest of the organization. So I think in terms of adoption, it really helps to, again, experience is no substitute. So having a small team, if you can, build out the experience, understand what it's like to be to implement policy as code, because there's going to be feedback for the developer. And you just don't want to turn on a policy and one day the developer's going to say, hey, what's this rule? Why is this failing? What is this? Like, you don't want to do that. You want to educate your team, and the best way to do that is to get the right folks involved at the right time, have them build it out, have them experience it, document it the best way possible, and make adjustments. And then when you're ready to go, release that out to the wider organization.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SaC. Mo was your host today with Tony Shong. We discussed what is policy as code and how you can make best use of it to bring security, operations, and developers together. Please pass it along to someone you believe can apply some of what we discussed here. For updates on upcoming episodes or to find out how to be our next guest, please visit magalix.com/thesac.